All right, today we're going to talk about Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. So basically, the presidents who served through most of the 1970s. And so to begin with, we're going to take a look at Gerald Ford and a little bit about his background. I'm not going to quiz you too much about his background, but I think it's important to, again, understand who the presidents are before they become the president. So we start out with Gerald Ford, and from a young age, Gerald Ford is a very likable guy. His name is not actually Gerald Ford, at least not at first. He was originally born Leslie Lynch King Jr., but when he was young, his parents divorced. Mom and dad moved away. He went with mom, and then when she got remarried, he was about 2.5, 3 years old, and they started to call him Gerald Ford after his stepfather. And that nickname kind of stuck with him through most of his life. Although Gerald Ford didn't legally change his name until 1935, and so it wasn't until after he graduated from college that he'll change his name. Gerald Ford has always been a leader. He was an Eagle Scout. He was a Boy Scout and an Eagle Scout, which is the highest rank you can get. He eventually went on to the University of Michigan, where he played linebacker on the football team. And if you're thinking maybe he was a bench warmer, no, he was a starter, and the team won the national championship 2 of the years he was there, so in 1932 and 1933. He did graduate. He wasn't just a jock. He ended up graduating with a bachelor's degree in economics in 1935, and that's when he had the opportunity to go play professional football. The Detroit Lions wanted to offer him a contract. This is a time when the Lions were actually pretty good. In 1935, the Detroit Lions won the World Championship. There was no Super Bowl at the time, so the Detroit Lions won the World Championship at the time. However, despite the fact that the Lions were good, they didn't pay enough money, and so Gerald Ford turned the opportunity down. Instead, he decided that he was going to go to Yale, where he got a degree in law. While he was there, he coached the Yale football team, and then eventually when the United States was bombing Pearl Harbor, he decided that he was going to enlist in the Navy. He enlisted in the Navy. He will quickly work his way through the ranks because he's pretty well educated, and he eventually becomes a lieutenant commander in the Navy. So he really becomes a leader at that point in time. From there, he gets out of the Navy, kind of has a couple jobs, and then the Navy really got him into politics. And so eventually he will go on to serve in the House of Representatives. He'll serve for over 25 years, 8 of them as the minority leader, which is a pretty important position within Congress. It's a key leadership role. And when he was in Congress, he was one of the more popular congressmen out there. Everybody liked him. Democrats liked him. Republicans liked him. He was very popular amongst most people. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is Gerald Ford is the only president who was never elected as president or vice president. Gerald Ford actually gets to be president and vice president, really, in kind of a weird roundabout way. So originally, Richard Nixon chose his vice president to be a guy named Spiro Agnew. So when Nixon runs in 1968 and again in 1972, his vice president will be a guy named Spiro Agnew. The problem with Spiro Agnew is he was kind of corrupt. He was involved in some scandals, and he is forced to resign. So when he's forced to resign, they have to appoint a new vice president. They have to pick somebody new, and Richard Nixon decides to pick somebody that everybody likes, this guy in the House of Representatives, Gerald R. Ford. So when Spiro Agnew resigns, Gerald Ford will then become the vice president of the United States. So he is not elected vice president. He is appointed by Richard Nixon. Then, of course, most famously on August 9th, 1974, Richard Nixon, after getting caught up in the Watergate scandal, eventually decides that he is going to resign. He realizes that if he doesn't resign, he's going to be impeached and potentially go to jail. And so instead of that, Nixon says he is going to save the country the fight. He resigns, which makes Gerald R. Ford the 38th president of the United States. So again, he becomes the first president who's not elected as president or vice president to become president. Which leads to probably one of the most controversial things that Gerald Ford ever did. Remember, Gerald Ford is a likable guy. Everybody likes Gerald Ford. Everybody likes Ford. But Ford's got a difficult decision to make. Richard Nixon has violated the law, or at least potentially violated the law. And we know with the whole Watergate scandal that Nixon probably should have spoke up, probably should have just thrown the people under the bus, but instead he tried to cover things up. And that left the nation pretty divided. Roughly half of the American public supported Richard Nixon and thought that there's no reason why he should have ever been there's no reason why he should have ever been well, he wasn't impeached, but forced to resign. They thought he was innocent. They thought it was just a Republican witch hunt going after the Republicans. On the other hand, the other half of the country thought that he was guilty, lying, cheating, well, you know. And so that left the country so divided that it looked like we were never going to be able to get on with any future business. So Gerald Ford makes one of the probably most important decisions of his career. He did the right thing. He did what he had to do, but a lot of Americans didn't see it that way. On September 8th, 1974, he formally pardons Richard Nixon. He says, I am going to excuse him from any crime that he has committed or may have committed, and he won't go to jail for that. So he basically lets Nixon off the hook for anything that he may have done. Gerald Ford's quote was, the ugly passions would again be aroused, and the credibility of our free institutions would again be challenged at home and abroad. Essentially, what he's saying is it looks really, really, really bad if the president goes to jail or the former president goes to jail. And so Gerald Ford will explain to the public why he does it.
The facts, as I see them, are that a former president of the United States, instead of enjoying equal treatment with any other citizen accused of violating the law, would be cruelly and excessively penalized either in preserving the presumption of his innocence or in obtaining a speedy determination of his guilt in order to repay a legal debt to society. During this long period of delay and potential litigation, ugly passions would again be aroused, and our people would again be polarized in their opinions. And the credibility of our free institutions of government would again be challenged at home and abroad. But it is not the ultimate fate of Richard Nixon that most concerns me. My concern is the immediate future of this great country. As president, my primary concern must always be the greatest good of all the people of the United States, whose servant I am. Finally, I feel that Richard Nixon and his loved ones have suffered enough and will continue to suffer no matter what I do, no matter what we, as a great and good nation, can do together to make his goal of peace come true. Now, therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
So there you have it. He ends up letting Nixon off the hook, and that ends up being a very controversial decision. We're going to take a look at this cartoon, and I want you to tell me, what do you think this cartoon means? What does it tell you? So I'll give you a second to answer that. Gerald Ford, the great mender. So one of the things about Gerald Ford being the great mender is he did what America needed him to do. Things would have gotten really ugly if we would have had to stand for a trial of Richard Nixon. It would have further divided the country, and we probably would have not been able to move on from that. And so Gerald Ford made the difficult decision of pardoning Richard Nixon. Now, the problem with this is that he lost a lot of credibility at that point. A lot of Americans thought that Richard Nixon should be put on trial, that he shouldn't be let out just because he's the president, and so that would upset a lot of Americans. And so Gerald Ford's approval rating goes down dramatically from that point on, and things will kind of remain low for the rest of his presidency. It's really going to take the most likable potential presidential candidate and make him into a guy that most Americans, at the time at least, really hate. So let's look at domestic policy. There were things other than the pardon that Ford had going against him. The first one being that the economy was not in great shape. We know that the economy was not doing too well under Johnson, and we know that things start to get even worse under Nixon. Even though Nixon's kind of keeping things alive, the economy just kind of goes down. The inflation rate is at its highest point in a long time. The unemployment rate is skyrocketing. Things are looking incredibly bad for our nation at the time. And so as unemployment goes up, as inflation goes up, Americans are not happy, and we need a solution. And so Ford comes up with a plan that's called WIN. His WIN plan is called Whip Inflation Now. And really, it's a brilliant plan if you think about it, but there were some problems with the plan. So Whip Inflation Now was a voluntary program that asked Americans to stop using gas and to try to save the amount of energy that they have. And the idea being, if we use less gas, gas was incredibly expensive at the time. If we use less gas, that means that the cost of shipping goods and all that stuff is going to go down. Americans are going to save energy, and that should hopefully help curb the inflation problem. Unfortunately, the Whip Inflation Now plan doesn't work, and the reason why it doesn't work is there's no incentive to do it. He asked people to cut their gas use, but there's no way to actually enforce it. There's no way to actually force people to cut their gas use. And so much like when the government asks you to do things today, I can say, please put your phone away, but if I don't have a policy and I don't take your phone away or write you a detention, then if you don't have any incentive to put it away, you're probably not going to put it away. And so that was one of the problems with Ford's proposal. Good idea. The economic theory behind it was sound, but unfortunately he needed to find a way to carry it out. Another problem that Gerald Ford had is he didn't get along with Congress. Now, it's ironic because here's a guy that was beloved in Congress, that always got along with Congress, but by now the Congress is heavily Democratic, and even some of the Republicans in Congress, they're not happy with Ford because of the pardon and some other policy issues as well. And so what ends up happening is Congress tries to pass all this stuff and Gerald Ford vetoes it. And then Congress tries to override the veto, and it's just a really difficult situation because Gerald Ford doesn't get along with Congress. And so a lot of what Congress is trying to get done, they can't get done because of him. He can't get his policies because he keeps vetoing their stuff. It's just not a very good working relationship. Foreign policy under Gerald Ford, maybe a little bit better. Still not perfect, but he does have a pretty decent foreign policy plan. So one of the things that we've been talking about in the 60s and even into the early 70s, the biggest thing going on is the Vietnam War. Now we know that Richard Nixon in 1973 reached a ceasefire with the North Vietnamese. The United States agreed that we were going to pull out in 1971, 72-ish. We agreed that we were going to remove our troops from Vietnam and that we were going to leave the North and the South to their own thing. And at the time, the North agreed that they weren't going to attack the South. Unfortunately, they don't keep their promise. And so North Vietnam eventually decides to resume fighting. They decide to go after the South. And this is when Gerald Ford steps in and says, look, this is capitalism here. This is the Cold War. This is communism versus capitalism. We need to support the South. We can't let the South get taken over by the North. And so Gerald Ford goes to Congress and he asks them for $722 million. And he says, we need this money to fight the war in Vietnam. And guess what Congress tells him? If you guessed that they said no, you are correct. Congress says, look, we can't give you that kind of money. And unfortunately, Gerald Ford was right. As soon as they didn't get the money, the North ends up overtaking the South completely in 1975, and both North and South Vietnam end up becoming communist. The good side of this foreign policy is that one of the things that Ford decides to do is carry out the legacy of Richard Nixon. We know that Richard Nixon was all about working with the communist nations. Now, not exactly giving in to them, not supporting them, but we know that we had that policy of détente. We had that easing Cold War tensions going on. We know that Nixon started at least negotiating with China, and Nixon started negotiating with the Soviet Union. We started to trade and kind of more normalized relations with those nations. And as a result of it, so Gerald Ford decides he's going to bring on most of Richard Nixon's cabinet, including his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger was the one who negotiated all those deals with China and with the Soviets. And basically what Gerald Ford said is, I'm going to keep the relationships going. I'm going to keep negotiating, and we're going to keep talking to China and the Soviets. We're going to keep trying to make things better. So there were some positives to come out of Ford's candidacy. 1976, Gerald Ford is up for re-election. However, there are a number of problems plaguing America at the time, one of them being that the economy is not good. Despite the Whip Inflation Now program, the WIN program, we know that doesn't work, and so the economy is still going bad. And a lot of Americans are really ticked off about the pardon. They just can't get over that. And so the approval rating of Gerald Ford is going to go down. Gerald Ford's approval rating is going to go down, and things are going to look pretty bad for him. So one of the things that people think about Ford is he's too much of a Washington insider. He's too into the game. He's just another politician. People thought that he was different when he was in Congress, but when he pardoned Richard Nixon, again, he kind of sets the precedent that maybe he's just like everybody else. Which leads us to the next guy we're going to talk about, and that is Jimmy Carter. In the election of 1976, there's this guy who kind of found his way into politics. If you're wondering why did a giant peanut toy just come along the screen, part of it is because Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer. Before he got into politics, he was a peanut farmer. He was a little bit involved in politics, but many saw him as a political outsider. Many people saw him as a fresh face in politics. And so instead of all these people who were inside the system and corrupt, or at least seen as corrupt, Jimmy Carter was seen as somebody different. So the election of 1976, it's going to be an incredibly close one, but despite being a close election, Jimmy Carter is going to be able to edge out Gerald Ford. He's going to be able to win by a pretty small margin. So he gets 50% of the popular vote, which is a 2% victory. He gets 55% of the Electoral College vote. As you can see, America is very much divided in 1976. All right, so we've got Jimmy Carter as president. Let's talk about his domestic policy. Let's talk a little bit about Carter the man. So like Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, he's a very likable guy. He's just kind of seen as this calm guy, this reassuring guy. He, as being a political outsider, he's somebody that a lot of people can relate to. And he takes a strategy from Kennedy and a strategy from FDR, and he will use his version of the fireside chat. He will go on radio and he will go on the TV, and he will start talking to the public and trying to really put things in a way that they can understand. And so one of the biggest problems facing America at the time is we still have an energy crisis. All right, so if we look at Jimmy Carter's first fireside chat, one of the first things that he mentioned, one of the first things he brought up was, how are we going to solve the energy crisis? One of the things that happened is America was falling short on gasoline because of the energy crisis created by OPEC. There was not enough gas available. We relied far too heavily on foreign oil. And so one of the things that Jimmy Carter talked about in his speech is that we have to treat energy usage like it's a war. We take war very seriously. We put everything that we have into war. And he basically says we need to treat energy the same way. We need to start saving our energy. And if we save our energy, that's going to bring the cost of pretty much everything down. And so the National Energy Act works like this. First of all, there is going to be a gas tax on any vehicle that burns a lot of gasoline. If you don't get good fuel efficiency, we're going to have a gas tax, a high gas tax. The second thing that's going to happen in order to encourage people to save fuel is to reduce the speed limit. Back in those days, the faster you drove, the more gasoline you burned. Today with cruise control, it kind of varies and it's a little bit different. But way back when, if you drove faster, you burn more fuel. So to save fuel, we limited the speed limits in most states. The third thing that we did is give tax credits for anybody who tried to come up with something that was green, that used an alternative source of energy. And so we look at alternative energy and green energy today. We would give tax credits for anybody who did that way back in the day. So One of the big problems with the National Energy Act is it was good in theory, but then when violence breaks out in the Middle East, OPEC has kind of some issues with us, and then all of a sudden we have an even greater shortage of oil than we already had before. And whenever we have a shortage in something, yes, you guessed it, the price goes up. And so although Jimmy Carter's plan was probably pretty good, it was a good plan in theory. When war breaks out in the Middle East and we get our oil supply cut off or at least seriously reduced, that is going to lead to heavy rates of inflation in our nation's history. And so the inflation rate hits over 15%, 12 to 15%, and the overall inflation will rise about 113%. So we'll see inflation more than double. And so this is another way that Jimmy Carter's plan, good on paper, not really so good in actuality. When all this happens, Jimmy Carter doesn't really know how to respond. And so he gives a speech. It's called his Mele Speech. And one of the things that happens when he gives this speech, well, I'll let you listen at first. When he gives this Mele speech, he doesn't really have a plan. He doesn't really have an approach. He mentions a number of different things that could be done to solve the problem, but not one solid thing at all.
Today that Jimmy Carter gave his famous Mele Speech. He never used that term, but that's the name that was given to a speech in which the president said the country's economic woes were due in part to a crisis of confidence in the country. It has come to be known as perhaps the most politically tone-deaf speech in modern American history. Take a look.
It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America. The confidence that we have always had as a people is not simply some romantic dream or a proverb in a dusty book that we read just on the 4th of July. It is the idea which founded our nation and has guided our development as a people. Confidence in the future has supported everything else. Public institutions and private enterprise, our own families, and the very Constitution of the United States. Confidence has defined our course and has served as a link.
So yeah, as you heard, he really has no real solution. He starts blaming it on the American conscience, and he starts blaming it on our confidence in ourselves. One of the famous lines from the speech, we have a crisis of American spirit at the heart and soul of our national will. So essentially he's saying that the crisis is caused by the death of JFK and with Richard Nixon being forced to resign, he's saying that really there's nothing uniting us. But at the end of the day, the cause of the oil crisis has nothing to do with national will or with JFK or with Nixon. All it has to do with is the fact that we're running out of oil. And we're not running out of oil because of the will of the American people. We're running out of oil because of the embargo and because of limits placed because of wars in the Middle East. So at the end of the day, the Mele Speech is a huge disaster. Jimmy Carter loses a whole lot more popularity as the inflation rate continues to rise. Inflation was headed sort of in the right direction, and then Jimmy Carter takes over, and we see a huge increase. Inflation will not only affect America, what we spend, but it'll also affect our quality of living. At one point in time, America had the highest standard of living of any nation in the world. By this time, by many indicators, we were ranked 5, and we were kind of falling from there. All right, so let's look at the rest of the economy. In order to understand the economy under Jimmy Carter, we kind of have to understand how America is changing in general, leading into the 1950s and 60s, and especially into the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So if we go back historically, from 10,000 BCE to 1850, what are most people doing for a living in the world? if you said they're farming, if you said they're working on agriculture, you're right. Somewhere between 90 to 98% of people during most of that time period were working on farming. But then all of a sudden something changes, something new happens. It begins kind of in the 1850s, but it really takes hold in like the 1870s and 1880s and really gets going in the 19 teens and 20s. What is that? That's what we call the second wave of the economy, and that is the Industrial Revolution. That is manufacturing. And so from 1850 to, some would say to the present, but really from 1850 until about the 1960s, 70s, I don't know, depending on how you look at it, there are different dates that could be put in there. But we really hit the second wave of the economy, where most people aren't working on farming anymore. With all the fancy farm equipment, most people from the late 1800s, early 1900s, most people end up working in manufacturing. They work in factories, they work on building stuff. So if you want to be successful in the second wave, you just got to be willing to work hard. You've got to be willing to go into work every day. You put into a hard day's work at the plant, you make money and you will be successful. But beginning somewhere around the 1950s, but really gets going in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, our economy begins to change. Now we start to see a little bit more competition, worldwide competition, not just from the United States. There's competition to see who can produce iron and steel at a cheaper price, who can produce clothing and rubber and automobiles and really any kind of goods at a lower price. And so as we start to do that, more and more Americans start to turn to that competition. They turn to foreign companies to make stuff, which starts to drive the American economy down a bit. And that enters us into the third wave of the economy. Again, begins in the 50s or the 60s, but especially in the 70s, 80s, really gets going in the 90s, and it is sort of the main part of our economy today. What we call the third wave is sort of the knowledge-based economy. And so if you want to be successful in the world today, it's not like way back in most of human history where all you got to do is be a big farmer and have a lot of land. It's not even like the 1850s to about the 1950s and 60s where if you just work hard in a factory, you're going to be successful. Most people in the third wave to be successful have to focus on knowledge-based fields. It's all about education. It's all about knowledge. It's all about thinking and doing. It's not just about manufacturing, making stuff, but today our industry is focused on the services. And so that's a big, big change in our economy. Most people don't work in manufacturing anymore. Most people in America work on service-based stuff. We make stuff. We're doctors, we're lawyers, we're teachers, we're educators. We're not actually producing a good, but we are producing some type of service for people. And so some of the things that pick up in the 1960s, things like communications, growing use of computers and phones and all that kind of stuff, we see a huge increase in the amount of transportation, especially with flight and advanced ships and, of course, cars. And then we see more and more retail trade. So these are going to be the big things in the third wave. And, of course, what that means is you have to have more specialized skills than ever before. Way back in the day, in my parents' generation, if you worked hard, if you just showed up and you were willing to put in a lot of physical labor, manual labor, you would do pretty well in society. But today, it takes, for most jobs, not all, but most jobs, it takes some kind of specialized skill. A lot of times that specialized skill is a college education, but not always. If you go into the skilled trades, you could make a whole lot of money, even if you don't have a college degree. But generally speaking, if we look historically, the more education you have, the higher your education, the lower your unemployment rate, and the higher your income. And so we see people with a doctorate degree, a PhD, or a professional degree, which is like a lawyer or a medical degree or something like that. Those types of professionals, they tend to make the most money on average per week. They also tend to have the lowest unemployment rates. So if you want to have a better job with more pay and more likelihood that you have a job, education typically is the path to take. Although skilled trades can get you pretty far today, just simply manual labor in and of itself is probably not going to get you a high-paying job. All right, so foreign policy. Under Jimmy Carter really focused extensively on foreign policy, trying to improve America's relations with the rest of the world. And his big stick, the big thing that he was in favor of, is the idea of human rights. So he wanted to create better living conditions. He wanted to take that Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we talked about with the United Nations. He wanted that to give that to all people in all parts of the world. And so a lot of his foreign policy is going to be based on that premise. That means the idea that we have of realpolitik, that idea of political realism, out the window. When we start to focus on human rights, we don't always talk about what's politically realistic. Jimmy Carter is very much an idealistic person. He wants what's best in a perfect scenario. And sometimes he's going to do some things that are pretty unpopular. You know that way back at the turn of the century, America built the Panama Canal. We essentially owned and had control of the canal through Panama. And in 1977, we agreed that come December 31st, 1999, we would give back the Panama Canal. We would give it back to Panama. So that wasn't in the original agreement that we reached with the Panamanians, but Jimmy Carter decided, you know, it's best that we give that land back to them and let them control their sovereign territory. And this is not a very popular opinion among most Americans. Most Americans are pretty ticked off about this. They feel like Jimmy Carter is focusing on foreign countries more than he's focusing on the good of the American people. Another area where human rights come into contention, the idea of Argentina and Brazil. Argentina and Brazil are both American allies, but they do some pretty nasty things. Like many of the other countries we've talked about in South America, we have helped to put evil, heinous dictators in power simply based on the fact that they are, yes, you guessed it, not communist. And so, well, we found out when Jimmy Carter found out people in Argentina and Brazil, when people were being tortured if they spoke out against the current government, even though it wasn't a communist government, Jimmy Carter said human rights is more important than ending the fight against communism. And so Jimmy Carter simply said, we're not going to give any more foreign aid to places that do not treat their people with respect, places that do not follow the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so as a result of this, Jimmy Carter huge steps as far as ending poverty goes. But the downside of this, of course, is that a lot of Americans thought it was just helping the communists. It was just helping those on the other side. But perhaps the biggest area where Jimmy Carter maybe has some successes and then some serious failures is in the scope of foreign policy in the Middle East. And so one thing that he is able to do, you know, you've learned about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and you know that there was a war between Egypt and Israel. Well, one of the things that Jimmy Carter is able to do is to get both sides together, and for 12 days they meet at Camp David. They meet at the president's private retreat, and he will get the two sides to talk and reach an agreement called the Camp David Accords or the Camp David Agreement, in which there is major progress made in reaching for peace in the Middle East. And so one of the things that we will see is that Israel agrees that they are going to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. So remember, that was the area that was attacked by Egypt, and then Israel went in, they kicked butt, they took all the territory. Israel decides that they will give back the Sinai Peninsula if, and this is a huge if Egypt recognizes Israel's right to legally exist. And so they agree to do that. And one of the things that we see is finally we're moving closer towards peace in the Middle East. Of course, you know, even today, there's still a lot of problems in the Middle East, and there are still a lot of debated territory and land and fighting going on, but at least things get a lot better. The Camp David Accords are seen as a huge success for Jimmy Carter, especially when it comes to foreign policy and human rights. The black eye of Jimmy Carter's presidency, and maybe one of the worst parts of his presidency, another reason why he's seen as very ineffective, is because of the Iranian hostage crisis. So this is the way things work. We know that way back in the day, the United States helped a guy named the Shah of Iran come to power. And the Shah of Iran is a CIA man, as you can see. Remember, we had kind of overthrown one of the Iranian governments. Well, we didn't overthrow, but we didn't exactly stop it from happening, and we may have given a little aid here and there. We put the Shah into power. And the Shah was not a nice guy. He was very corrupt. He would spend hundreds of millions of dollars of Iranian money. Well, he could get rich, And meanwhile, the rest of Iran was struggling. The rest of Iran was poor. But the Shah of Iran was, you guessed it, not communist, and so America was a supporter of the Shah. And so one of the things that we see is that most of the people of Iran, they don't really like the Shah of Iran. He is sort of really, really bad when it comes to human rights, and he does a lot of corrupt things. But again, because he's not communist, America likes him. The rest of the people don't. Enter Ayatollah Khomeini. In January of 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini leads the Iranian Revolution. He is a Muslim leader, and he helps to overthrow the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran is going to get out. He doesn't die. He doesn't get killed, but he's forced to flee Iran, and he will go into exile. Meanwhile, the Shah of Iran is going to establish a theocratic government. He's going to say that the government is going to be controlled by the Islamic faith, by the Muslim faith, by Muslims. And so that is going to be the beginning of the story. Now, where things really get complicated is about 10 months later, once we hit October of 1979, the Shah of Iran, or the former Shah, shall we say, comes down with cancer. And when he comes down with cancer, he needs cancer treatment. Well, where's the best place in the world to get cancer treatment? You guessed it, right here in America. And so the Shah writes to the President of the United States and says, hey, can I come to the United States and can I get some cancer treatment? I want to be cured of cancer. Will you let it happen? Well, Jimmy Carter doesn't want to see a foreign leader die, especially one who at one point in time was pro-American. And so Jimmy Carter says, yeah, you can come to the United States. You can come get your treatment here. That's not going to make Iran very happy. In fact, in Iran, the people of Iran and the Shah of Iran, they are going to want the Shah not to be allowed to enter the United States. In fact, they want the Shah turned over so he can put on trial. They do not want the Shah to come to the United States. And so one of the things that Iran is going to do as a symbol of rebellion is a group of Iranians are going to break into the American embassy in Tehran. They are going to then seize the embassy, and they are going to take 52 Americans as hostage. And they say that they will release the hostages when we release the Shah of Iran. When we return the Shah of Iran to Iran, that is when Iran will release the hostages. Well, Jimmy Carter is stubborn, and maybe not even stubborn. He's a good guy. He knows what's going to happen to the Shah. He knows they will kill the Shah anyways. And so he says, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to turn over the Shah of Iran. And so we reach a standstill. So eventually we reach a standstill where if Jimmy Carter doesn't turn over the Shah, they're not going to release the hostages. And both sides are pretty stubborn, and neither side is willing to give in. And this is going to turn into something that is very, very, very unpopular for Jimmy Carter. Because a lot of Americans say just give over the Shah of Iran. It is American people who are being held hostage right now. We need to bring them home. We need to get them home. There were a couple plans to kind of try to bring those people home. They kind of failed big time. Now, if you're looking at the picture and you're thinking, thank you, Canada, what does Canada have to do with any of this? Well, one of the things that happened is when the embassy was being seized, a few people got away. A few people weren't captured. They were able to make it away, but they couldn't get out of the country. And Canada will pull some really brave stuff in order to get the hostages. Well, they weren't hostages. In order to get the people who were trying to make sure that they don't become hostages, in order to get them out of Iran. Canada will actually forge some documents. They will call into a private session of Canadian Parliament in order to authorize a plan that will have the Canadians working with the CIA. Because it turns out that a lot of those people who escaped who didn't get captured, they're going to make it to the Canadian embassy, the Canadian ambassador's home. And when they get to the Canadian ambassador's home, one of the things that they do is the Canadian ambassador risks his safety and his life in order to help hide these people. Now, eventually, the Iranian hostages are all freed. Anybody want to take a guess as to when? Well, if you didn't get the exact date is January 20th, 1981. And that also happens to be the exact same date that Ronald Reagan took the oath as president. Once Jimmy Carter was no longer president, the Iranians finally said, all right, you can have your hostages back. Here you go. So that is that. That's the end of the Iranian hostage crisis, and that is the end of the Carter presidency. And so next time we'll focus on Ronald Reagan. But for now, have a great day.